we're going to begin with a discussion of what went into the selection of our fuel break requirements, an overview of the related, how it fits within the fire district's strategic wildfire risk reduction plan, and provide an opportunity to answer any questions that this presentation may evoke. Marcia, if you could let me share screen, please. Excellent. So directors, as many of you have, and certainly anyone who's attended any of the many public conversations we've had about this topic, the Bay Area is not only a fire prone, but it's a fire dependent landscape. The map on the right shows historical wildfire history, and the map on the left shows the breakout for our specific area. For orientation on the map on the left, the squiggly line going from top right to bottom left is Highway 24. You see the footprint of the 1923 Berkeley Hills fire, as well as the footprints of the 1970 and 1991 fires. Not shown on here is the 1988 fire that occurred in the Lost Valley area that we previously discussed in open session. There's a list of local fires there on the right. The ones on the top are all ones that were associated with a Dabla wind event, characterized by very dry air coming out of the northeast. Typically a Dabla wind here, Santa Ana down south, or a Fern wind up north. And then we've had two significant relative to our local area, not significant in the larger scale, maritime influence events, which are the sort of a normal day, if you will, in the summer, where winds are coming from the west and they're bringing that moist air off of the ocean. Obviously in 1988, and then in 2018 on Buckingham in Moraga, where a disker hit a rock, started a fire that got some wind on it. Of note for 2018, while that did not involve any structure loss, the response was benefited from the fact that a resident had called in the disker, the dust from the disker is smoke, and the full balance of alarm was on scene when the fire started. So we're not for that fortuitous event that brought all of us there in advance of the fire ignition. That very easily could have burned the homes where it bumped the fence. As a reminder that for fire science, that in our area, wildfire is a normal and recurrent feature. This is a fire dependent landscape. There are different theories on this, but Scott Stevens from UC Berkeley, who I subscribe to, suggests a 3 to 5 year returning fire cycle before European development in this area. Those numbers are verified by tree rings in the redwood forests, where grass fires would encroach into the area. And when fire burns, it spreads via two components. There's the flaming front, or the ground component of fire, that moves in a linear manner from vegetative item to vegetative item. And then there's three-dimensional ember cast. And three-dimensional ember cast is the carrying sparks, flaming brands, embers, etc., carried aloft by wind that can travel up to miles in advance of the main body of fire, although the density of ember cast is significantly increased within a quarter mile of the flaming front. And when those embers land in a receptive fuel bed, they can start new fires. They can rapidly grow into large fires in their own right. One of the examples we listed above was from 2019, where a fire burning in Benicia, a flaming ember flew across the Carquinez Strait over the town of Crockett, landed in the vicinity of the Cummings Skyway, ignited a separate fire that burned several hundred acres and threatened homes. And when we go to model wildfire spread, specifically the ground component, and there is a Monte Carlo simulation that can be done to include ember casts within modeling, but that's really challenging because you need to model the fuel bed that created the embers, you need to model the winds that carried those embers aloft, and you need to model where those embers will be deposited out of the wind. And then you need to model whether or not there was a receptive fuel bed at that location, whether that fuel bed had horizontal and vertical continuity to surrounding fuel beds. There are a number of variables there, which is why Monte Carlo simulation is used for ember production. But when we model wildfire and when we look at the outputs, we're looking at the inputs of topography, weather, and fuel. And topography is unchanging or unchangeable. Weather is changing, is very dynamic, but within the near term, as in the next several years, we can look at historical weather patterns to get a sense of what's a worst case scenario. Now, the frequency of those worst case scenarios is very variable. As an example, last year we had no red flag events. This year we haven't had any yet, but we are likely in the remaining 6 to 8 weeks or so of fire season that we have ahead of us. And in years such as 2017, we had some of the largest fires in state history burned in December. So there's a great degree of variability about timing of weather, but what is well understood is what an extreme weather event looks like. And that is good for several years in advance. We're going to a hotter, drier future. I think that's a statement of fact, but it will take time and it's incremental change. So our current understanding of worst case scenario weather is very applicable. And with regard to fuel, in this case, we're primarily talking about vegetative fuel, but there are circumstances under which structures can become the fuel most likely to carry the fire. And that's that point of transition from vegetative fire to structure fire, and then from structure to structure and urban conflagration. Models fall apart at that point and are not in the current environment capable of modeling fire spread with structures as the primary fuel carrying the fire. So we're primarily talking about vegetative fuel. And there we're talking about the loading. So that's tons per acre. In the technical memo that is attached to the staff report, there's discussion about the various fuel loads associated with fuel types in our area. And the next is configuration. Grass is a great example. Uncut tall grass greater than 3 feet, which is fuel model 3, has the same tons per acre as cut grass that is lying flat, but it does not have the same burning characteristics if the surface area is changed. It does not have the same access to the oxygen it needs to complete the fire triangle. So the configuration is relevant to the fuel model in addition to the loading. And the last is a combination of live and dead fuel moisture levels, which is a combination of the moisture that's present in live and dead fuels, and then the size class specific to dead fuels, and the amount of time it takes that size class to equalize with the ambient environment. Those are generally classified by hours, from 1 hour to 10,000 hour fuels, and it speaks to how quickly they equalize. In the case of grass, which is a 1 hour fuel or a light flashy fuel, it equalizes with the ambient environment within 1 hour. So in our case, our large grass covered slopes are not available as fuel within 1 hour of fog coming in, because the moisture of extinction for grass is 12%. And if that grass has absorbed enough moisture from the surrounding environment, this is dead grass, mind you, live grass is a different category. But if that dead grass has absorbed enough moisture from the ambient environment that has exceeded 12% dead fuel moisture, it is no longer available to burn. So it can still be there, and it can still have the same configuration, but because the moisture levels have changed, it is no longer available to burn. So all of these elements are highly variable, and they really suggest that if one is going to conduct highly detailed and site-specific modeling, you need to have all of this information readily available and the ability to update it over time. As an example of what the environment here looked like, once upon a time, here's a picture of historic Orinda. I would draw your attention to the hills in the background, where you'll note the absence of brush, the absence of large trees, other than the occasional scattered oak down in the riparian areas. This is a classic oak savanna, dominated by light flashy fuels that historically were managed by nature in equilibrium through regular and recurrent fire, then were managed through grazing. And with the exclusion of fire and the cessation of grazing activities, the construction of homes and the planting of non-native plants, as well as the unconstrained growth of plants that previously would have been contained and managed through wildfire, we have transitioned from this with the environment in or close to its natural equilibrium to what it looks like today. I'm not going to insult anybody with putting up a picture of what it looks like today, but I think everyone knows it doesn't look like that anymore. So to that point, what's the environment we're in here, and what are the things that inhabit it? It's a little hard to read here, but this is the Federal Register from December 5th, 1997, which was when the Alameda whipsnake was declared a federally protected species. When Jeff was talking about the HCP, the Habitat Conservation Plan that's in effect on East Bay mudlands, that's largely driven by the need to protect the habitat for the Alameda whipsnake. And I'll read from this, from the Federal Register, and it says, this snake and its associated habitat are threatened by fire suppression and related wildfire problems associated with lack of fuel reduction, urban development, genetic isolation, and excessive livestock grazing. So one of the challenges that the whipsnake has is that when we get to the examples that are given, is the encroaching of thick concentrations of mature brush, of closed canopies, of other things of an environment that's not being managed either by recurring fire or by active management. These have a negative impact on one of the protected species whose habitat makes up a large portion of our district. And so this is just an example of how fire safety and environmental conditions are often hand in hand, and that the measures that we are seeking with regard to reducing the fuel loading and the fuel configuration that would support high intensity, rapidly spreading fire not only is it a negative outcome for the habitat if there is a destructive fire, but the exclusion of fire creates second and third order effects if not filled with something else. In this case, active management of the landscape in order to reduce tall shaded stands of vegetation and providing a mosaic. And the key here is providing a varied fuel mosaic that's beneficial for fire, that's beneficial for habitat as well. Next, we have an example of fire modeling. There was a lot of discussion about fire modeling and how we view the landscape. This shows a fire start on the south side of Bear Creek Road in vicinity of the Orinda Downs, specifically just downslope from the end of Orinda View on the very north end of town. This is using 81-degree temps, 4% humidity, and 20-mile-an-hour winds out of the north. The winds and the temp are relatively mild, but the humidity is on the very low end of the range. And we see by hour how fire is likely to spread across the landscape. And you'll note that the fire is not moving in a contiguous manner. There's splotches out ahead. That's indicative of long-range spotting on a wind-driven fire. And as those embers find receptive fuel beds, they spread some more. This was some early modeling we did as part of the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break to get a sense of what work the fuel break would do. This is right along the footprint of the North Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, and to get a sense of the need for additional fuel mitigation measures downstream of the fuel break within the community, so that if we had a start that jumped the line, which is likely in a wind-driven fire, what would be the benefits when fire became established in the community, and how could we segment the continuous nature of fuel loading so that we would have an opportunity to contain this fire before it transitioned into structures. Here's another example, fuel modeling using 24 mile-an-hour winds at 17% RH out of the northeast. So a little bit more wind, a little higher RH coming out of the Lafayette Reservoir. Once again, we see very quickly the model shows the fire going into spotting, because there's a lot of things that break up the contiguous natures of fuels in that area, to include the school with a very large parking lot play area and some other areas that don't lend themselves to rapid fire spread. And despite the fact that there's a lot of good work that's been done right up along the perimeter of Lafayette Reservoir by East Bay Mud and by the residents who live there, once that fire got established and embers started to be carried aloft by the prevailing winds, there's potential for very rapid spread if the fire is not contained every time it lands, if it's not boxed in when the fire hits the ground, if you will. So the wildfire modeling that we use there and in other work, it's all based on semi-empirical mathematical models. There's a little bit of deviation here of late, but generally speaking, this all comes from Rothermell's 1972 work, which was digitized by Finney in 1997 with Farsight, which was the first digital wildfire spread model. Generally speaking, they can run on 5-meter fuel data. That said, there are some work, specifically the folks down at UC San Diego who have a supercomputer are using lower resolution model, but the computing power goes up dramatically. As an example, the CAP models that are being run for reinsurance pricing is a 90-meter model. So a very, very coarse view of the landscape. And they require up to 6 months of computing power to run the model at a landscape scale. So there's some real limitations as far as computing data and the availability of fuel data. The next one has to do with what fuel model you're running on it. The standard that everyone has been using for quite some time to include the recently released CAL FIRE hazard severity zone maps in LRA and the pending, in SRA and the pending LRA maps, which we anticipate seeing sometime next year. That's all running on 2014 land fire data at 30-meter resolution with 2019 SALO data for derived from planets, satellites having to do with tree coverage, and even that's missing some subdivision. So the current state of the art is 2014. In July of this year, a 2020 update was released, and that's still being rectified. So generally speaking, fuel data is going to have a multi-year lag as far as what's available. And at 30-meter resolution, which the land fire is, as an example, Orinda View with 14 homes on that does not show up on land fire because there's too much canopy cover and the trees are too distributed. So in a 30-meter or 90-foot pixel, those homes are classified as a montane forest because you can't see them. So work done at the micro scale will not show up in 30-meter data. And there's some limitations on what can be modeled because there are limitations on understanding what's on the ground at scale with an annual update, because depending on the fuel model, say in grass, there is no residual value on that work in a subsequent year because it has grown back. East Bay Regional Park District is the lead fiscal agent on a state grant that we're collaborating with that is producing a fine scale vegetative fuel mapping project for Contra Costa and Alameda County. The only part that's currently been released is the 20-meter ladder fuel, which is from 1 meter to 4 meters. So the model starts 3 feet from the ground and goes to 12 feet. That's the only output that's been released so far from that project. It's continuing. They're doing a great job, but this stuff is relatively complex and slow going. It'll be several more years before that fuel data will be available, at which point, obviously, it'll be a little more dated. There's the collection map. Purple is, we're primarily in the purple area. We have a little bit of that orange down past Canyon there. That's all collected in 2019 and 2022, and will be several years before we'll be able to run models against this fuel layer. So this brings us to the question of what MOFD is doing and how we see all of these efforts to include our fuel break ordinance as part of the overarching strategy. This was published in 2019. This still guides our work and continues to inform our priorities. So we've continued to work on external fuel projects, specifically the North-Orinda Shaded Fuel Break, the Tunnel Fuel Break, and the Pinehurst Fuel Break that was completed. The East Bay Tunnel remains underway. We continue to encourage internal fuel mitigation projects to include fuel breaks to create defensible space around homes and to reduce the fuel loading in the large parcels that have areas beyond 100 feet from homes, typically those parcels that are greater than 1 acre. We continue our ongoing efforts to be prepared for a wildfire through pre-planning. Part of that is our participation in Master Mutual Aid throughout the state, where we are creating and qualifying members who have the experience and the state qualification to act in higher level operational roles, such as a division supervisor. We currently have 3, one of whom is a captain, which is essentially unheard of in that space for local government. Ensuring that our pre-plans are prepared. So as I've spoken to the board about in the past, in the event of a large scale wildfire, we are going to have hundreds of fire engines here very quickly. And it's the organization and the effective employment of those firefighters and the conditions we have set in advance that will be the difference between a large scale fire and a fire that reduces the damage. To Lucas's point from his report, when lines are prepared, when positions are, when firefighters know they can take a stand and there are local folks who can guide them to those places, we're far more likely to have a positive outcome. We continue to carry out our evacuation planning. Obviously, Zone Haven was an output of that, as well as things such as the upcoming evacuation exercise in partnership with the police department from Lafayette, Moraga-Orinda, understanding that all of these are interrelated, as well as Caltrans and CHP. We continue to push progressive updates to the building code, the most significant of this being the Wooey Fire Area adoption that the board approved several years ago that applies ember-resistant construction to new buildings and to major remodels throughout larger elements of the community, and the adoption of the very progressive exterior under eave sprinkler requirement for buildings that are otherwise required to have NFPA 13D sprinkler systems. Taken together, all of those start to create a hardened community where we are less likely to experience rapidly spreading fire, and we are more likely to have evacuated our residents in advance. We continue our extensive and ongoing community outreach and education process, although from the comments received, we can always do more, and we're committed to continuing those efforts. And then lastly, we've done quite a bit of development with early detection and notification that primarily rests now with the alert wildfire camera system that we use and is integrated within our computer-aided dispatch Luke was talking about earlier. As part of that outreach and education during 2020 to 21, we went through a community wildfire protection plan adoption process that was approved in April of 21, and that is published as an appendix to the Contra Costa County CWPP that does not have area specific details since it was a countywide. Our CWPP includes in section 5 detailed recommendations for fuel mitigation. At that time, those elements were included as section 325.6.3 of the fire code. Were subsequently moved out of the fire code at the behest of the East Bay Regional Park District. For external fuel breaks, these are our 2, the large ones are shown. The Pinehurst is a smaller one that fills in the gaps between these. North-Orinda Shaded Fuel Break shown on the top, moved from Aquilani's High School up to Inspiration Point and then out Nimitz Way, essentially to create a buffer against the north end of the district. That was carried out on a combination of East Bay Parks, East Bay Mud, and a small amount of private land, as well as the Orinda School District had some land. The tunnel East Bay Hills fuel break is intended to pick up where the North Orinda shaded fuel break left off and brings it around from Cal Shakes all the way around to Sky High to essentially complete a line, if you will, of modified fuels around the fire district. It was pointed out, and I certainly take pride of authorship of it, that I've recently opined on the efficacy of fuel breaks, and the timing of that, obviously, with proposed ordinance is interesting to say the least. I think there's a really important distinction to be drawn between exterior fuel breaks such as these that are created in open spaces around a community at that transition of vegetative fuels as the only fuel capable of fire into the wildland urban interface or intermix, where we see the vegetation to structure and potentially structure to structural pathway establish themselves. In these settings, fuel breaks are far from ideal. And were we to do this again, we would be advocating for something more nuanced, using the splats concept or something else. There are real constraints with the way state funding is distributed that that gives preferential treatment to fuel breaks. And I don't know that these projects would have been approved were they proposed as splats instead of a linear fuel break. That said, a splats concept, which is outlined in my recent guest article on that topic, to institute splats, you need a lot of space. You need space, you need experts, and you need a multi-year plan that involves rotating treatments throughout the area to create that varied fuel mosaic. That's what East Bay Parks is doing, and that's what East Bay Mud is doing. In the case of East Bay Parks, that's been enshrined in a modification that they requested and we approved. East Bay Parks has a plan. That plan has now been reviewed and vetted and approved by the fire district as the agency having jurisdiction. And essentially, from our perspective, that issue is resolved. I spoke with East Bay Mud this morning. We anticipate receiving their request for modification shortly, which I believe, I don't want to speak for them, but I believe will allay their concerns about our fuel break ordinance, because they have an HCP, they have a fire plan that was signed in 2000, they have professional staff, they have a management plan for their lands. We are not opposed to things such as that, where more nuance and subtlety can be applied, being approved via the modifications process. And we have a very high approval rate for those, particularly when it comes to plans that are thought through, where the landowner or land manager has both the space, the resources, and the commitment to creating a more nuanced plan. Fuel breaks are one size fits all. That is a true statement. Fuel breaks are also a starting point of the conversation for those who have the appropriate space in order to create alternate means and measures to achieve the same practical effect. The same practical effect for our purposes is not 100 feet fuel modified space. It is a landscape that is not predisposed or capable of supporting fast moving, high intensity fire. If we can arrive at that same outcome, which mimics the natural state, we are in violent support of that plan and eager to work with folks who have the interest and the ability to do so. So to my point about internal fuel breaks, we did a deep dive on the fuel breaks back in 1999. The fire district was formed in August of 1997. These, we assume, were included in the fire code prior to that date. We just don't have records going back, because prior to the formation of MOFD, the dependent special district of Orinda and the independent special district of Moraga, their files were shipped off as part of a brief consolidation with county fire, and we don't have those records anymore. But going back to 99, fuel breaks in some shape or form have been included in the fire code. In 2022, we removed fuel breaks from the fire code, as well as defensible space, based on concerns raised by the East Bay Regional Park District that the fire code is a subset of the building standards code. The building standards code does not apply beyond the exterior wall of the building, and therefore is inappropriate to have vegetation management in that document. That was further supported by Greg Anderson from the Office of State Fire Marshal, who made comments in a Building Standards Commission meeting. So to be responsive to that concern, in 2022, we moved these items out of the fire code into ordinances, which were adopted on first and second reading by the board. I previously discussed why I think internal fuel breaks are distinct from external fuel breaks. This is a space where the WUI fire problem and WUI fire study and science and so forth is moved so fast that we just don't have the vocabulary to provide the distinction on things that are with this sort of subtlety yet. We regularly hear people refer to fire breaks, which is bare mineral soil, something the fire district does not require and does not endorse due to the impacts on sedimentation of surface waters and potential for runoff. But we regularly hear these terms being used interchangeably. And this is a case where I think there will be quite a bit of benefit of having an additional distinction So that internal fuel breaks are viewed as something like enhanced defensible space, which is how LA City views it, with a 200-foot defensible space requirement. There's more work to be done here to get the naming convention right, but from my perspective, an internal fuel break inside a developed area such as Moraga-Orinda Canyon, and Bollinger is fundamentally different than external fuel breaks in the surrounding parklands and watershed. Internal fuel breaks are also very helpful in places where we have structures located within 100 feet of a property line. State law says that structures should have 100 feet of defensible property line unless, 100 feet of defensible space surrounding every structure, or to a property line, whichever is closer. The property line element of that has nothing to do with fire science. That has to do with private property rights, et cetera. And so when we separate fire science we separate our requirements from fire science and we focus on property lines. A wildfire is wildly disinterested in jurisdiction or ownership. The wildfire will spread where there are contiguous fuels. So creating internal fuel breaks not only enhances defensible space, but it creates a varied fuel mosaic that we believe is beneficial from an environmental standpoint, as outlined in the Federal Register, elements associated with the whip snake, and also more closely mimics the natural environment. It's also worth noting that there's been quite a bit of discussion about why this new ordinance and why is it moving forward so quickly and why is there so little public comment. I would note that our previous ordinance 2304 was adopted with public comment and drew largely from 2203, which had been in place from the prior year, which drew largely from 2001, which was adoption of the 2019 fire code. So there's a continuity here. And from a practical standpoint, there are two things in 2308 that are different than 2304. One, it allows for the retention of non-irrigated brush within fuel break spaces, providing that certain separation requirements are met. And it specifically lifts the fuel break requirements. It's a small number of parcels, but there are some parcels that are not in or adjacent to a community at risk, as designated by the state of California in 2003 and 2008. Or a parcel that has or is adjacent to a habitable structure. This is a very small change. It primarily applies to East Bay Mud and East Bay Parks, whose issues are largely being addressed in modification. So from staff's perspective, and I certainly concede to the volume of correspondence received and the number of people who are here tonight, that this view may not be shared. But from staff's perspective, this ordinance was simply providing an opportunity to put more robust CEQA statements, asserting the categorical exemption from CEQA for a number of reasons, and to make a very minor adjustment that was less restrictive. It's worth noting that our enforcement of 2304 was suspended due to threatened litigation in early August, which was why there was the urgency to move forward with the proposed update in a more rapid manner than supported extensive community outreach. Were it not for the suspension of 2304 due to the pending litigation, if we were making updates to this, it would be a much more fulsome community engagement. It would be drawn out over a longer period of time. But from a staff perspective, the changes were immaterial with regard to the requirements that it faced on the residents would face and the potential impacts compliance with this ordinance throughout the field that the fire district would have on the natural environment and on folks' work. Just as a quick point out, defensible space, this is work done within 100 feet of a house or within about 10 feet of a roadside. Just like the 2304 with fuel breaks, defensible space was moved out of the fire code in 2022, currently lives in ordinance 2303 and is separate and distinct from ordinance 2308. Of note, the only time that combustive ground cover is banned is within 2 feet of a structure, as referenced by 2303, and the reference to hazardous vegetation being banned within a fuel break, which includes mulch and bark, that has to do with, per the state forestry guidelines, that has to do with mulch or bark that's accumulated greater than 4 inches. So spread mulch or bark is not a violation of code or ordinance anywhere but 2 feet from a structure. It would be a large pile or large mound, which we sometimes see from either dumping or from a chipper operator who's not paying attention and built a very large mound. A large mound of mulch is inconsistent with both environmental protections and with fire safety. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the fire district requires ember resistant construction under 7A or R337 in the residential construction code. Through the WUI fire area designation that the board passed several years ago, this expands the requirement for ember resistant construction. MOFD also continues our home hardening grant program as previously discussed with gutter guards and vents. And then just as a reminder from the staff report I delivered in April of 2022 to the board, NIST technical note 2205 really identifies 3 elements that are common to all from structure laws. And it has to do with what type of construction is used, which we address through ember resistant construction for new homes. However, we cannot require retrofits of existing homes. It has to do with the fire's intensity and its duration, which is derived from topography, fuel, and weather, and then with ember exposures. And to mitigate against those, you really have 2 choices. On the left side there, you have the idea of a dial you can turn up to reduce the exposure by removing fuels, reducing fuels, or relocating or reconfiguring fuels. And on the right has to do with structure hardening. So the example that the author of that report gives is that if we all built our homes as concrete bunkers, the example on the right, we would need to do no fire safety stuff. Or if our landscape was nothing but gravel or bare metal soil, we would do nothing to harden the homes. But it's a combination of the 2 of those. And in the case of a mature built out community such as ours, there are very real limitations on what we can do on the hardening structure side. We can only do voluntary measures and only do the small number of homes that are sold, that are rebuilt or new construction are the only times that we can apply more restrictive building codes and ember resistant standards for structures. So that most of our wildfire risk reduction as a community needs to occur on the reducing the exposure side of that equation by reducing fuels, removing fuels, relocating or reconfiguring them. And that's why we believe this ordinance is critical to the district's fire safety and our ability to survive the inevitable contact with a wildfire. I have just put up here as a very brief example of the elements that are changed in proposed ordinance 2308 versus 2304. They're highlighted. Item C, this is from section 4. Item C is that non-irrigated brush can be retained as long as there are separations as outlined in A, B, and C there, and that under trees at the bottom, this has always been our practice, but we included it based on concerns that were voiced that it wasn't clearly articulated. The trees less than 15 feet will be trimmed 1/3 of the height of the tree, which gives it time to grow. And when it exceeds 15 feet, then it would revert to the state standard of 6 feet of clearance from the lowest portion of the foliage to ground or ground fuels. But as I mentioned before, from a staff perspective, the changes were minor and were less restrictive than what we've been enforcing for the last several years. In response to concerns about making sure information was available to residents, we've got the following items have been posted on our website. The first is a residence guide.
You need to pause share and do a new share. All right.
Stand by. All right, the first is a residential guide to environmental best practices for wildfire risk reduction. This maps very closely to the document that was shared from Marin County. And you open it up, it includes, starting on page 147, there are maps showing presence of federally recognized protected species and habitats throughout the county. This was produced by the Diablo Fire Safe Council and is specific to the biome that we have here, not only in the county, but in the fire district specifically. We also produced a frequently asked questions document there was a lot of questions about modifications. So there's now a list of frequently asked questions. This was derived specifically from mail we've received, as well as from the themes we saw as we went through the list of modifications. Under habitat for wild animals, we spoke with Fish and Wildlife. They asked that we include this email address and their phone number for any residents who have a question about habitat, riparian, or any other questions having to do with environmental sensitivity. And then below is a equal discussion or a related discussion associated with riparian areas and creeks. We found as we went through the list here, riparian areas are poorly understood. There was also going through the list of modifications. It was clear that it was not the folks were having a hard time understanding what to do. So there's a new modification extension request form. Down below, there's the actual form itself that's linked. This is much more interactive than the old form, and it walks residents through the various elements and gives, depending on which drop down they select, and in this case, it would be the drop down for fuel break modification, extension, or request. It takes them directly to a series of questions that derive from the FAQs, such as, do you believe you were issued this in error because someone else owns or controls? We see a lot of that with roadside stuff, where either the city or the town owns or controls the roadside, or the resident believes they own or control. That's obviously parcel by parcel. There's some distinction there. There's discussion about if you just want an extension, how long? Makes it much easier to break those out. If you want a modification, what's the nature of modification? If you have presence of habitat, there's an opportunity to submit the documents. We've also added more robust elements, more robust language as referenced in the staff report and in the proposed ordinance. In addition to the CEQA elements, more robust information pointing residents to environmentally sensitive ways in which they can carry out work. I will hold there and be happy to answer any questions from the board or members of the public.